Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you all today. So we're doing another tier list, but because we recently did our Season 19 deck tier list, I wanted to talk instead about techs. This is something I've done every now and then as metas shift. I'll talk about not decks within the meta, but techs within the meta. What staple cards are good to use, which aren't as good, and how I'm feeling overall about each of these individual cards' places in the meta. So this tier list is going to be a little bit different. Rather than go from S, A, B, C, D like we normally do, we're still going to have like ranks here, but ranking techs in terms of like S, A, B, C I think is a little weird because it's not always necessarily true that like one tech card is always better than another, but there are just different categories they fall into. So we're going to cover cards that you should play everywhere. These are cards that you should probably be playing 3 of in just about every single deck, 3 or 2. Play if you have room. Oh, nice. I misspelled the word dependent there. Play if you have room. This is like, this card is good, but if you don't have room for it, it's fine. Don't necessarily have to play it, but generally speaking, if you do have the room for it, it's good to play it. Deck dependent is pretty self-explanatory. If this card works well in your deck in particular, play it, but it's not for every deck. And then down here at the bottom, we just have cards that are just frankly a little bit mediocre in this current metagame. So we have 20 cards we're going to cover here in no particular order. I'm going to start with Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. So this card is quite good in this metagame, I think. I will definitely go ahead and be slotting it in the play everywhere column. I mean, this is something that's been true for most of Master Duel. I will say at the start of Tier 0, a lot of people, myself included, were dropping Ash Blossom and Joyous Springs for DD Crow. It was believed at the time that DD Crow had more impact in that particular matchup than Ash Blossom does, which now that we've been a lot more familiar with tier elements within the Master Duel meta in particular, it's pretty safe to say that Ash Blossom and DD Crow, specifically against tier elements, have kind of comparable power levels as Disruption, but of course Ash Blossom is going to be good against many more decks and situations than DD Crow is. So Ash Blossom and Joy Spring I think has always been here. Again, a few months ago, some people might have said it's in the play if you have room column, but I definitely think you should be playing 3 of this card in pretty much every single deck. There are some decks actually branded kind of treats Ash Blossom more as play if you have room. It does not always play that card, but I think for like 90% of decks, you will be playing 3 of this card. So next up, we have Called by the Grave. This one is technically kind of deck dependent because in specifically tier elements, this card is actually not great at all because if you end up banishing, in the mirror match, if you banish a tier element name from your opponent, you still can't use it for that turn and also for the next turn. Now, again, this was a lot more relevant in tier element format, but tiers are popular enough deck that the mirror match is going to be facing itself often enough that I think Called by is still probably not worth it in tier elements, but in literally everything else, I think, yeah, you just place you Called by the Grave. Coincidentally, both of these cards are really good against another card that is on this list, and you've probably seen in about, I don't know, if I had to spitball, 87.8% of decks played an average of 2.81 cards per deck, but who knows where I'm grabbing those figures from. All right, next up we have Crossout Designator. This is a card that I always go back and forth on. Ever since it went to 1, I've always just been going back and forth on this card. I think this is kind of the definition, though, of a tech where you just play it if you have the room. It is also slightly deck dependent as well. You could make an argument for putting Crossout Designator here because Designator really shines if you're playing a very meta deck, particularly if you're playing like Tier Elements or Sprite or even like Despia or Dragon Link. There's a high chance you'll have a mirror match, and then this is literally just quick play spell, Solemn Judgment, but more importantly, it's good against other certain tech cards that appear quite frequently in a lot of lists. As well as, of course, stuff like Ash Blossom and Call By and all that, too. I think this is ultimately play if you have room. Oh, the other point I was going to make about it being deck-dependent is this tends to be better in combo decks for countering certain bugs. Normally, decks like Flandres don't really need an effect like this because, they do want to counter stuff like Ash Blossom and Imperm, but those aren't as widely played as certain other things. So, I'm going to put this in play if you have room, but there are certain decks that don't want Crossout Designator at all. All right, speaking of DD Crow, we talked about it a little bit earlier when talking about Ash Blossom versus DD Crow within the tier limit meta. DD Crow, I think, is pretty firmly just going to be in the bottom category here. I think it's really just mediocre in this meta, honestly. We have the Bystials, right? And we'll definitely be talking about those later as well, because I do think those are good as general tech cards, not just in light and dark dependent decks, although, I don't know. Again, we'll talk about it in a little bit here. But DD Crow, honestly, pretty much every deck that it was relevant against was using light and dark monsters in the graveyard anyway, so this card has just kind of, in my opinion, been completely ousted by Bystials. It would take another very significant graveyard-based deck that's not light or dark for DD Crow to be, like, in contention against Bystials as a tech choice, I think. And even then, I think it would be deck dependent. Even then, I think some decks would play Bystials and DD Crow, obviously ones that want to banish their own light and darks. But DD Crow, I think for the foreseeable future, is most likely going to be shelved in most lists. It's not a terrible card. Again, stuff like Flaunderies and Leerless that can actually use a level 1 Winged Beast might even still want to play it. But no, I think for the most part, you can just tech Bystial monsters. Dark Ruler No More. This is an interesting card, and this might seem a little bit weird, but I'm actually going to put it in the deck-dependent category. I actually, when I first was picking cards for this tier list and thinking about, their spots, I was like, oh, Dark Ruler No More, that's like a play it if you have room, right? Like, if you want to board break going second, and you want the option to, when you have the slots, you can sometimes play it, but I really do think that Dark Ruler No More ultimately ends up just being a going second card, like a purely going second card. I mean, regardless of, what kind of deck you played in, but I think it's so much of one that I wouldn't really consider it outside of like side decks or decks that always want to go second. I think that Dark Ruler No More, I even tried it during the Sprite meta when it was like at its best as a tech choice for like, decks in general too. And even then I was just not impressed with it. I, of course, have a whole video talking about cards that are only good going second and how I am generally not fond of them, but that's not going to impact the ratings here. I'm going to try to be very objective about this, but even being objective, I think that like, even if you want a card that's really, really good going second specifically, like most people are just going to play evenly instead. Not only is evenly cheaper as a super and not an ultra rare, but I do think it is honestly the better card in this meta. So Dark Ruler No More, if you're very, very specifically on a going second deck, you can consider it, but otherwise I wouldn't play it, honestly. Alright, Forbidden Droplet. This is actually going to be one that's also pretty deck dependent. Droplet is a very good card when it comes to not only board breaking, but also disruption. Unlike cards like Dark Ruler No More and Evenly, this card is actually very good to go going first or second. The thing is, though, and why I call it deck dependent is this card is very resource hungry. You almost always, actually pretty much every single time, want to be negating multiple monster effects with this. Even if you're using it as disruption, ideally you want to be hitting multiple monsters. If not to negate their effects, then to stop them from battling over your board. And in that regard, you do end up needing a lot of spare resources, either on hand or field, in order to be resolving a droplet that's going to have a lot of impact. And that's not something that every single deck can afford. In fact, a lot of combo-based decks really, especially in this meta, need like all the resources they can to extend or make their plays, and usually everything left over is like some kind of disruption, like it's like Imperm, Sea, Ash Blossom, a Bystial, just something you didn't use for the combo, but can still be disruption in its own right. And in that regard, Droplet actually ends up not being that great, because those are not the kind of cards you want to be sending for a Droplet. Droplet is good, particularly in decks like Tri-Brigade is like a perfect example of a deck Droplet is great in, because it'll often have leftover Tri-Brigade monsters it searches, it'll often have leftover Tenki. Live Twin is another good example. They leave a lot of continuous spell and trap cards on the board, and will generally only go off using like one, maybe two cards, so you can use the rest to act as fodder for the Droplet there. So yeah, Droplet ends up being very deck dependent. Harpy's Feather Duster. So in the past, this is a card that I played quite a bit, but I honestly was playing it. I was thinking about this recently, because in my going second video, somebody actually, I remember this, left a comment that was like, hey, you didn't really talk about Harpy's Feather Duster. You used to play it all the time, even though it's really just a going second card. And I hadn't really considered it much. It's like, Harpy's Feather Duster really is just a going second card, isn't it? But I think the reason I was more content to play it more often in the past was because stun decks were more of a thing. And stun decks were more of a thing because Unlike now, where we have a lot of floodgates, a lot of the very relevant ones at 1, they were at either 2 or 3, and as a result, stun decks were just more prevalent in the meta because they were a lot more consistent. I really like where floodgates are at right now. That is to say, skill drain rivalry and goes in at 1, and there can be only one, I think is at 2, right? As well as, I think that's actually it. There might be another one I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but I think that's a pretty good place for them to be. Stun is certainly viable still, but at the same time is a lot less consistent, although it can still play Extravagance and Prosperity and Duality, so like, does that even really matter? But long story short, since those Floodgate cards have gotten limited and stun decks in general have just gotten weaker as, meta decks have gotten stronger, I don't find myself needing Harpy's Feather Duster. Like, honestly, for a lot of decks, even if you do happen to run into stun, you have some in archetype or at least in engine, in deck way to handle, 1 or 2 floodgates or to play under them. Or, stun is already such a rare matchup, and even then the floodgates are mostly only relevant when you go second. So, is that really a matchup that occurs often enough anymore to prepare for? I don't think so. So I actually am going to put Harpy's Feather Duster down here. I don't think the card is good right now. I think it's pretty mediocre right now. Alright, so let's talk about evenly matched for a second. I mentioned this before, but for those who don't know, I made an entire video a few weeks ago about how I specifically focused on evenly matched because it's the most popular of these, but I talked about how I don't like playing cards that are only good going second outside of a deck that is dedicated to going second, because you're just playing a card that's going to get bricked 50% of the time anyway. And it's just not, I don't like playing bricks in my deck. Now, to be fair, Evenly is an exceptionally good card, and there are a lot of boards you can really only break with a card like Evenly. I'm not saying Evenly is a bad card, I just don't think it's particularly great. I'll side deck it. It's a side deck card all day long. Like, you 100% side deck 3 Evenly in tournaments, but in best of 1 ranked ladder, I generally want the cards that I'm putting in my deck to be useful, more often than not. So, but that said, Evenly, I think overall, and again, in keeping with being objective, I think it's a card you can play if you have room. 2 or 3 copies, I think playing only 1 isn't really worth it. I don't even really think 2 is worth it, to be honest. If you want to see it consistently going second, you really should be playing 3. If you can spare the room for 3 extra cards specifically dedicated to going second, and that is really what it comes down to with a lot of decks and why I don't play Evenly, is I just don't feel like I have the room for that niche of a slot, but if you do, go for it. Alright, Psyframe Gear Gamma is going to be our next card. This one's going to be, it might seem weird to put it in this category, but I find this to be a card that is really deck dependent. But it's not like it slots into certain archetypes necessarily. It's like, it really depends if you can make use of the bodies if you play Gamma on your turn. Like if you can sync for a level 8, that's always really good. It's also like you need to have room, but it's more than needing to just have room for the Gammas, because you also need to have room for the driver. And I think it comes down to being deck dependent, because there are a lot of, there are some decks that can afford to get away with playing a literal Garnet, the driver, more so than others. Again, I'm thinking of Tri-Brigade, right? Again, like what I talked about with Droplet, although this is for a different reason. Tri-Brigade has multiple link monsters that are very relevant to your combos, and you'll pretty much always go into, that have the ability to, in exchange for drawing or searching a card, putting a card back from your hand into your deck. And I think having a plan for if you open the driver, I think that is going to be very important. So as far as what decks to play Gamma in, I think it's either a deck you, again, really want the body and also have the space. In that regard, it is also kind of a play if you have room card, and or if you have a way of putting back a driver that you open with. I think those are going to be 2 very important factors to look into when considering if you want to put Gamma in your deck or not. Alright, now we're going to talk about Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. I think this is actually a pretty underrated tech in this meta. There are a lot of decks, honestly, the Bestials have kind of shown us how prevalent graveyard effects matter in this meta. And although Bestials can, not only banish the card out of the graveyard, but also put a very relevant body on the board, and then also have an additional effect. Ghost Spell doesn't have that, but Ghost Spell does hit a lot of more relevant cards than the Bestials do. Bestials can only banish a light or a dark monster. Ghost Spell can stop cards that are, monsters other than light or dark, that aren't even monsters, effects that don't involve just a light or a dark monster needing to be in the graveyard for whatever reason. It can stop cards from being banished out of the graveyard, from being moved out of the graveyard for whatever reason. And again, there is a lot of that happening in this meta. Excuse me. Not just with light and dark monsters like with the Bestials can counter, but in general. I'm going to put Ghost Spell here. Again, I don't think every single deck has the space for it, but if you do, I definitely think it's worth considering in this meta. Ghost Ogre is a card we haven't talked about in some time, or really played around with recently. It was really good in the Sprite meta because it's really good against specifically Gigantic Sprite. It also had some other relevant targets in that meta. In this one, though, destroying a monster on the field that's activating its effect is a recipe for disaster against so many decks, right? Tier limits being the main culprit, but also like Branded Bestial. This is often not going to be like too impactful of effect because like if you use it on like a Lubellian or an Albion that's activating its effect, they still get to just fuse with it anyway. Like it doesn't really impact that. It's just overall pretty mediocre in this meta. Effects that destroy also doesn't negate the effect, it only destroys the card, right? So effects that only destroy are just not going to be that great right now. Alright, next let's talk about Infinite Impermanence. This is a card that's fantastic right now, and in general. It's another one of those cards that's pretty much always good, and, you know, like Ash Blossom and Callby, I do think this is you pretty much play this card everywhere. Even in, like, very combo-based decks, I very much like Infinite Impermanence. So, I talked about this, jeez, I mentioned this video so much, because a lot of these cards we talked about in that video, but in my video about going second cards, my going second card that I put in a lot of decks is Imperm. That sounds really weird because it's not specific to going second, but I do think it is important to have a plan in your deck for if you go second, but I don't think that plan should be exclusively for going second like Evenly is. Imperm, in a lot of my combo decks, I'll jam 2 or 3 Imperm, and, you know, that'll help me if I'm going second, they start trying to, you know, they play through a Maxi or something like that. I can Imperm to stop them as well. And then if I go first, you know, that's fine too, because I can just set Imperm, and it's another negate on my end board. So it's like, I am totally, like, I don't know. I just think Imperm is, like, the better Evenly. That's just how I see Imperm. Imperm is, like, the much better Evenly, in my opinion. Maybe not as strong in its effect, but a lot more flexible. And yeah, I think, again, I think it's a more if you have room. I think, generally speaking, most decks should probably be playing 2 or 3 Imperm. Alright, Lightning Storm. I'm not really going to talk about this one because I've already talked about a lot of the reasons why I think cards like this aren't good. It only destroys and doesn't negate like Ghost Spell, so I don't think it's good in that regard. And it's also only good exactly if you're going second, like, you know, Dark Rule and War. I guess in that regard you can make an argument that it is actually deck dependent, but I also think in a lot of going second decks, like, you really could just banish stuff with Evenly. It's really only in, like, hyper turbo going second decks like Numeron I think you'd consider Lightning Storm. So I think overall, even for a deck that specifically wants to go second, like I'm thinking of Sky Striker, right? Like in past metas, it was actually probably fine to play Lightning Storm and Sky Striker, and in fact I have in the past, but in this meta, even if I was going to try to play Sky Striker, I would definitely not play Lightning Storm in it. I would always play Evenly first, so yeah, I'm just not a huge fan of it right now. Bestials. This is actually pretty interesting. Bestials is like one of the only cards I actually want to put in like 2 categories at the same time. This is kind of play if you have room, but it's also kind of deck dependent too. I think I'm going to put it in deck dependent. So the reason that Bestials in it being deck dependent is because even though they're particularly useful as disruption against your opponent's light and dark monsters, you still want to have the ability to summon them if you're not playing against a deck that's playing light or dark monsters. Like, you know, we don't want to be playing a Deity Crow that's like a literal actual brick, like completely useless against certain decks, right? So in that regard, you do need to have some amount of light and dark monsters in your deck to play Bestials, but also kind of the reason I say maybe play if you have room is because, like, pretty much every deck right now has some amount of light or dark monsters, right? I'm thinking particularly of Sprites. Sprites aren't a deck that really takes use of the Bestial monsters' bodies or effects that well, but you can still very much play them, and often I think it is right to play them right now in Sprites just purely as disruption, but that's also an archetype that has a lot of dark monsters. I think, yeah, actually, I want to think about this for a moment while I have a sip of water. Yeah. I think it's going to be deck dependent. I think ultimately we're going to keep the Bestials here because I'm thinking about a deck like Sword Soul. Well, I mean, you can play them in Sword Soul, but Sword Soul also plays light and darks. What is it that plays no light or dark monsters? Well, that's the thing. I can't even think of one off the top of my head. But like, I guess Adamancipator, right? Like, Adamancipator is pretty much pure Earth. I wouldn't play Bestials in Adamancipator, so I think it's deck dependent. It's just that a lot of decks right now can play them. All right, I don't need to talk about this card, right? I say this on every single tech video, staple video, tier list. I don't need to talk about Max C. It's just going up there. All right, Nibiru. Wow, this is another one where I actually don't know where I want to put it. Like, there's a part of me that still wants to put Nibiru here, that it's just mediocre in this meta. I think in some regard it can also be deck dependent, right? Like I think 60 card decks have a lot easier of a time playing Nibiru. And there was a little bit during the last season, season 18, where I was thinking to myself, like, maybe it's actually time to play Nibiru again. But that might have also just been me playing decks that get wrecked by Nibiru and, like, coming across it every now and then. I'll say this much. I think it's more right to play Nibiru now than it was in Tier 0 meta. But I think ultimately I am going to say that Nibiru is actually mediocre in this meta. And it's not just because of tier limits. It's also because of Sprite and its variants. Between Sprite and its variants turboing out Gigantic to obviously stop Nibiru's summon, in addition, of course, to making their plays, but also incidentally, Nibiru stops, or Gigantic Sprite stops their board from being Nibiru'd. Between that and also tier elements, I think makes the Nibiru not really worth playing. Because even though we're not in Tier 0 meta anymore, like Nibiru is obviously terrible against tier elements and wasn't played during Tier 0. Even though we're not in that meta, tier elements plus sprites is still about the representation that tier elements had like before this meta. So yeah, I think that ultimately Nibiru is still mediocre. It's close though. It's very close. Like, it wouldn't take too much of a meta shift at all for Nibiru to pop back up to play if you have room status, but I do think it's going to be just ultimately mediocre. All right, Shifter, this one's easy. I don't think it needs much explanation. If you're not playing a graveyard-based deck at all, you can play Shifter and wreck the very much graveyard-dependent meta right now, with the exception of Sprites. But yeah, I think even then, like even in Sprites, I don't think it's really that worth it to play Shifter anymore because like Sprites can play under Shifter, but they prefer not to. And in Tier 0 meta, you definitely need the Shifter to keep up. But now, I don't think that's necessarily the case. So Shifter, again, it's just very deck dependent. Flow, XO, you still always play Shifter in those, but most decks you don't. Super Polymerization. This is actually closer to play if you have room than you might think it is. It's ultimately going to be deck dependent because Super Poly tends to be better in decks that want to fuse anyway, but the Legend Anthology event, I jammed Super Poly in that event because obviously they hit a lot of these types of cards we're talking about. And, of course, obviously event metas aren't representative of, actual ranked ladder, but the event did allow Garura, and Garura's coverage with Super Poly is pretty insane. Like, again, this card is pretty close to being a general, like, a lot closer to being a general tech than a lot of people realize. But the, like, tiebreaker that kind of makes it not worth it is, like, I think Evenly is just a better version of Super Poly if you're looking to use it generically. It doesn't take an extra slot, it doesn't take a discard, and it's a lot easier to use. Like, it doesn't require your opponent to have a specific board. But Super Poly is flexible in that it can be used as both board breaking and as disruption. You can just set it if you go first. But again, I think it is ultimately going to want to be played in specifically fusion decks. But if your deck fuses at all, and if you have Garura, room for Garura in your extra deck, I think it's worth it to very much consider just jamming Garura and Super Polys. Alright, Triple Tactics Talent. I'm still very, very up on this card. I'm definitely going to put it in the play if you have room category. It's a very, very good card, and pretty much every deck can benefit from it. Again, it's good going first or second because it's very easy if your opponent to play something like Maxi or Ash Blossom during your turn 1. And if that's the case and you have a talent in your hand, you could use talent to rip a card from your opponent's hand and kind of make sure that, if they're going to disrupt your turn, you can disrupt theirs as well. So, yeah, talent I think is pretty easy play if you have room. And then finally, Effect Veiler. This is another one I think is actually play if you have room / deck dependent. I think it's actually more deck dependent. That might seem a little bit weird. Veiler is actually generically good in metas where every deck wants 3 Imperm and then also beyond that. I'm thinking in particular of like Math Mech meta. But in this meta in particular, the 3 Imperm is definitely enough. And Valor tends to only really be good if you want light monsters in the graveyard, or if you can occasionally make use of a level 1 tuner. Sometimes like Celine, the spellcaster type, might be relevant. So I think Valor is like... I think Valor should only really be considered if you're playing a deck that wants more than 3 Imperm, which again I don't think is very many decks at all right now. Or if you want the bonus of, like, you know, the things Valor can offer over Imperm. Alright, so this is our tech tier list for the current meta, and yeah, I am pretty reasonably happy with where everything is here. Nibiru is the one that I'm most on the fence about, but I've been on the fence about that all last season, so, you know, just like, you know, I feel like it could be justified in pretty much any of these bottom 3 tiers here, but otherwise I think this is a pretty good definitive place to have all these cards. Of course, don't be afraid to let me know of what you think of all these different tech cards, or some others I didn't cover here. Feel free to let me know in the comments section below. But that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. Let us now move to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation. You do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot, as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now. So without further ado, this is XLex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.